On April 8, 2009, a skiff came up beside Maersk, Alabama in the Indian Ocean. 4 armed men were close enough to climb. That is the first problem. This was not an unmarked corner of the sea. It was one of the most monitored piracy zones on Earth, watched by merchant captains, naval planners, insurers, and governments. The risk was known before the latter touched the ship. And still, the gap was there. By April 12th, 3 of the attackers were dead. Abduwali Abdukhadir Muse was in American custody. Captain Richard Phillips was alive. That is the part most people remember. But the question in this episode is not only how the standoff ended, it is how global trade, warships, insurers, and international security structures could all see the risk and still leave an opening large enough for 4 armed men in a small boat. The answer sits in the space between 4 documents: a federal criminal complaint in New York, a congressional hearing on maritime security, United Nations reporting on Puntland, and the shipping market's price of risk. Read together, they make the Maersk Alabama case less like an isolated attack and more like a stress test. The ship did not sail outside the modern anti-piracy system. It sailed inside it, and the system still left an opening. There are 4 evidence stops to keep on screen as the case unfolds: the DOJ complaint for the boarding, the CTF 151 record for the naval response, the UN reports for the shore networks, and the World Bank trail for the ransom economy. The film version can move from ship to lifeboat. The record has to move through all 4. Start with the route. Maersk Alabama was a U.S. flag container ship carrying cargo in the Indian Ocean, including food aid bound through the region. In the spring of 2009, that mattered. The Horn of Africa was not a random danger zone. It was the edge of a shipping corridor that connected the Red Sea, the Gulf of Aden, the Arabian Sea, and the Western Indian Ocean. If a vessel used the Suez route, it eventually had to pass near Somalia or take a long, costly detour around southern Africa. On a map, the choice looks simple: move through the corridor, accept the risk, and rely on naval patrols, speed, distance, and onboard procedure. In a finance office, the choice had columns: fuel, delay, insurance, crew risk, cargo schedule, contract obligations. That is the first mechanism. Piracy worked because the sea lane could not simply be abandoned. In January 2009, the multinational naval response had a new name: Combined Task Force 151. Its mission was counter-piracy. Its patrol area covered one of the largest maritime spaces on Earth. The problem was not whether navies had ships. The problem was math. Thousands of merchant movements crossed a region measured in millions of square miles. A destroyer could protect the water around it. It could not be everywhere a skiff might be. That gap became part of the business model ashore. Somali piracy in this period did not begin as a Hollywood image of men wandering out to sea. It came from the long collapse of state control after 1991, from coastal economies with few stable alternatives, from local armed networks, from financiers who could supply boats and weapons, and from ransom negotiations that turned captured ships into assets. Puntland was central because it offered shoreline, local protection, and a political gray zone. A captured vessel needed an anchorage. A pirate group needed guards, interpreters, food suppliers, fuel, negotiators, and a way to move ransom money. The attack at sea was the smallest visible part of the enterprise. The larger machinery sat behind it. Stig Jarl Hansen, writing during the piracy peak, described Somali piracy as a land-based problem expressed at sea. J. Bahadur, reporting from Puntland, found the same logic in person: ports and towns where piracy money moved through families, businesses, militias, and local status. United Nations monitoring reports trace protection networks, financiers, and officials who tolerated or profited from the trade. In plain terms, a skiff could leave the coast because people on shore made the departure possible. If the skiff succeeded, a much larger chain was waiting. Maersk Alabama met that chain on April 8th. The federal complaint filed in New York says armed men boarded the vessel, took control for a time, and later ended up in a lifeboat with Phillips as hostage. The exact experience of the crew belongs to the crew. This script does not invent what they thought or felt. The usable record is narrower. It gives dates, charges, actions, and the legal theory the United States brought against Muse. What the complaint records is enough. The attackers came from the sea in a small boat. They reached a large commercial vessel. The crew resisted. The situation shifted from ship seizure to hostage standoff. The attackers wanted safe passage. The U.S. Navy brought warships and negotiators into the case. By April 12th, Navy marksmen fired, 3 attackers died, and Muse survived to face prosecution in the Southern District of New York. That sequence is dramatic, but drama can mislead. A rescue story makes the case feel finished at the moment Phillips leaves the lifeboat. The federal docket shows the next phase. Muse was not a character who disappeared into the closing credits. He became a defendant. He pleaded guilty in 2010 to charges tied to hijacking, kidnapping, and hostage-taking. In 2011, the court sentenced him to 405 months in prison. The trial record matters because it changes the scale of the story. On the water, the event lasted 4 days. In the court system, it ran for years. In the insurance market, the risk had already been priced before the ship was boarded. In Puntland, the incentives existed before Maersk Alabama left port. The rescue ended one hostage case. It did not end the conditions that produced the attack. In popular memory, the case is often framed as one captain, one crew, one lifeboat, one elite military action. That version is not false as a description of the final hours. It is incomplete as an explanation. The records say something wider. The congressional record asked why merchant ships were still exposed, despite naval patrols. Maritime agencies issued advisories and best management practices. The shipping industry measured risk through war risk areas, premiums, routing decisions, and armed or unarmed security debates. UN investigators followed money and protection networks ashore. The court prosecuted the surviving attacker, but the court could not prosecute a shipping lane, a failed Coast Guard, a regional economy, or an insurance calculation. That is the myth vs. record beat for a modern case. The movie-shaped story says the case is a test of one captain under pressure. The record-shaped story says the captain was inside a chain already built by state collapse, route economics, insurance pricing, naval limits, and Puntland's ransom economy. The captain mattered, the crew mattered, but the system made the encounter possible before either side saw the other on the water. Look at the insurance side. By 2009, the Gulf of Aden and nearby waters had become a risk category. Underwriters, ship owners, and security advisors treated piracy not as a rare surprise, but as a cost line. War risk premiums, kidnap and ransom coverage, route planning, and security contractors all grew around the same fact. Ships still had to move. When risk gets priced, it does not vanish. It becomes manageable for some actors and unbearable for others. For a ship owner, the question might be whether the premium and security costs were lower than the cost of delay. For a crew member, risk was not a spreadsheet. For a pirate investor on shore, the same premium system signaled that the target had value because the global market was already admitting the danger. This is the uncomfortable mechanism of the case. The richer and more organized the shipping system became, the more legible its weak points became to people outside it. Maersk Alabama was not the largest prize of the Somali piracy era. It was not the longest captivity. It became the most visible American case because of the flag, the hostage, the naval response, and the later film. Visibility is not the same as representativeness. The wider pattern looked different. Many captured vessels were held for weeks or months. Ransom negotiations moved through intermediaries. Crews waited offshore while families, insurers, owners, and negotiators tried to close a price. The World Bank later estimated hundreds of millions of dollars in ransoms across the Somali piracy years, with much larger indirect costs imposed on global trade. That number matters, but not because it turns piracy into a balance sheet. It matters because it shows that the attack itself was only the entry point. The profit came after capture, when a ship became a bargaining object. Maersk Alabama disrupted that model. The attackers did not end with the ship anchored off Somalia and a long ransom channel opening. They ended in a lifeboat surrounded by American naval power. That changed the immediate transaction. It did not change why the attempt made sense from shore. The midpoint of this case is the moment the question changes. At first, we ask how 4 men reached a container ship. After the lifeboat, the better question is why the whole anti-piracy structure depended so much on what happened after contact rather than preventing contact in the first place? The answer is geography and jurisdiction. A navy can patrol a corridor, it can escort convoys, it can respond to a distress call, it can disrupt a mother ship, it can arrest suspects if domestic law, evidence handling, and political will align. But piracy in Somalia used a coastline and an inland support chain that navies could not police from the sea. The armed skiff was maritime. The business behind it was not. That is why the naval response could be tactically successful and structurally incomplete at the same time. CTF 151 did not fail because its sailors lacked skill. It failed as a complete answer because its mandate treated the visible stage as the battlefield. The visible stage was the water. The production office was on land. Puntland's local economy made that possible. Not every person in Puntland supported piracy, and the sources do not allow that kind of blanket claim. The point is narrower and stronger. In specific coastal communities, pirate money could pay guards, suppliers, elders, officials, translators, mechanics, and young men with few better options. A successful ransom did not enrich only the men who boarded. It flowed outward through credit, debt, protection, and status. If a failed state cannot reliably punish the investors, and if the global shipping route cannot reliably avoid the coast, then the system has room to repeat itself. That room was visible before April 2009. International reporting had already described rising attacks. Maritime guidance already told vessels to increase speed, maintain lookouts, rig barriers, and report to coordination centers. The United States and its partners had already created dedicated anti-piracy forces. The shipping market had already changed prices around the route. Maersk Alabama was not evidence that nobody saw Somali piracy coming. It was evidence that seeing the problem did not equal closing the system that produced it. The crew's resistance matters here, but it should not be turned into a moral fable. The crew followed training, improvised under danger, and survived a takeover attempt. Their actions helped prevent the boarding from becoming the normal long-form Somali piracy scenario. A captured ship moved toward anchorage, guarded offshore, and converted into a ransom negotiation. Phillips became the hostage in the lifeboat instead. Those facts carry human weight, but if the episode stops there, the explanation stops at the moment when the public story becomes most cinematic. The better record is colder. It asks how many ships crossed the same water, how many had no armed guards, how many relied on speed and watchkeeping, how many insurers priced the route, how many naval vessels were close enough to respond, how many pirate investors had to lose money before the model stopped looking worth the risk. Those are not questions a lifeboat can answer. The legal case against Muse narrowed the event to a defendant. That is what courts do. Courts need charges, counts, evidence, pleas, and sentences. The indictment and sentencing documents name the acts tied to one person. They do not name the whole machinery that made the act thinkable. I read the criminal case as a necessary narrowing. It punished the survivor the United States had. It also made the case easier to remember as a story about a few men rather than a route, a coast, and a market. That narrowing is not a flaw in the court. It is the difference between justice and explanation. After 2009, the response changed. Industry practices hardened. Armed security became more common on many routes. Naval coordination improved. International pressure on pirate financiers and coastal networks increased. Attacks later declined sharply. The decline had multiple causes, and no single source should be allowed to claim all the credit. Naval patrols mattered. Best management practices mattered. Armed guards mattered. Prosecutions mattered. Political pressure on shore mattered. The important point is the combination. Somali piracy rose when the sea lane stayed valuable, the coast stayed weakly governed, local actors could profit, and ransom systems could pay. It fell when the cost and probability of success changed at several points in the chain at once. That is why Maersk Alabama is a useful case. It is small enough to reconstruct and famous enough to distort. The fame pulls the viewer toward the lifeboat. The documents pull the viewer back to the chain. There is one more caution. Modern piracy is not an old legend. Some people in this case are still alive. The crew members were not props in an action story. The Somali attackers were not symbols detached from place, poverty, coercion, and choice. The surviving defendant was tried in a real court and sentenced to a real prison term. Serious reconstruction has to keep all of that in view without turning harm into spectacle. That is also why the Hollywood frame is too small. It gives the viewer a clean emotional shape. Danger, courage, rescue, closure. The records give a messier shape: state collapse, shipping dependence, risk markets, naval limits, local economies, criminal prosecution, partial deterrence. The clean story is easier to watch. The messy story explains more. By April 12, 2009, the lifeboat was no longer just a lifeboat. It was a point where several systems touched: American military power, federal criminal law, a global shipping route, Somali coastal economics, and the market price of maritime risk. 3 shots ended the immediate standoff. They did not create the case, and they did not explain it. Maersk Alabama did not begin when 4 men climbed a ladder in the Indian Ocean. It began when a collapsed coast, a compulsory shipping corridor, a ransom market, and an overstretched security architecture made that ladder worth carrying. The rescue is the visible ending. The system is the story. That distinction is the case's real archive. Not one heroic frame, but a map of pressures that briefly became visible around one ship. Visual reconstructions in this video are AI-assisted and grounded in the records cited for this episode. They are not archival footage.